We are continuing our Onward series that we've been in. And what we've been looking at in this series is Jesus' path that he lays out, that he gives an opportunity to all mankind to follow. And it basically goes, here's a different path to live, and here's how you can move onward in your life a different way than you've ever heard before. Now, as you are all aware, we live in a fallen and broken world. And we specifically live in a society that is slowly but steadily falling apart for the last 50 years. Now, those of you that might be a little older than 50 or say even 40s or a little, how many of you have noticed our society is slowly disintegrating over the last several, okay. This is pretty easy for us to see. Let me give you some examples to put this in context for you. On the side of drugs and drug use, currently in America right now, 23.9 million Americans admit to using illegal drugs on a monthly basis. All right, that is almost 8% of our entire population of the United States on a monthly basis use illegal drugs. On the crime front, we have 2.4 million people that are actually behind bars sitting here this morning. 2.4 million people locked up around our country for serious crimes. Poverty. We have 109 million, which is actually 35%, so more than a third of our population is on some form of welfare currently today. 52 million people are receiving food stamps and on the poverty front. On the education front, only 25% of graduates are proficient in math, English, reading, and science, which are the things tested on the ACT. Tests that you take in your junior, senior years. Only a quarter of our people graduating are proficient in all four areas, which is a massive downgrade over the years. Our children, 41% of our children are born to unwed mothers. In 1960, so you can see how this slide has gone, in 1960 that was 5%. 2015, it's 41%. These children growing up with only one parent are 4 times more likely to be living in poverty, 3 times more likely to end up in prison, and 50% more likely to live in poverty as adults. The family. Let me first put the chart up there. 50% of families today are affected by divorce. If you see this chart, probably hard to read all the details back there. This gives you from 1950 to 2004 the divorce rate percentage in America. And as you can see, somewhere between about 1970 to 1980, it went from being about 22% up to 50% in that decade, and it has never dropped. And it stayed at about 50% of marriages now are affected by divorce. Divorced families see a 35% drop in their disposable income. Divorced people are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. And they are 4 times more likely to suffer from depression, chronic depression. Their kids are 3.5 times more likely to drop out of school. They are 26% more likely to have some type of health problem, and they are 3 times more likely to have behavioral problems. Only 42% of our children today that live in America that are between the ages of 14 and 18 actually live with what would be considered their first marriage family. So actually live with their biological mom and dad still in a marriage relationship. Only 42% of our children that are teenagers today live in situations like that. That means if you are a child and you live with your mom and dad who are your biological mom and dad, you are the oddity, you are the rarity today in our society. That is our society. It has been a steady decline for the last 50 years as the United States of America. Now, when you look at those stats, how many of you feel overwhelmed at times? Are you like me? Like when I hear that stuff and I study it, I am overwhelmed because my view of these things when I read these things aren't just to sit there and go, oh, wow, that's bad. I look at them and go, how do you stop it? How do you fix it? How do you do something to turn that tide around? And we talked about this in Sunday school class, my class last week. And we spent the whole hour just kind of going, how do you turn that tide? How do you change things? Not just go, it's just what it is, but how do you change it? And if you start thinking that way, if you're like me, at times you get very overwhelmed. Do you not? You just look at it and go, what can I, one person, do to actually change that tide, to change that trajectory that it is all heading right now, which is on a downward slope? How do I affect that? How do I change that? And what happens at that moment when you ask that question, at that moment, when you ask that question, is people come in and they will give you an answer. And does anyone know what the common answer is of how you fix all those societal issues? What is it? Throw more money at it, right? That's what we always hear. You look at that stuff and then people go, the way we fix it is we give more money, we throw more money at it, and have more government and state-run programs, and that will be the thing that starts to turn things around. Now, here's the problem, is we have been spending for the last 50 years more and more and more money on programs to fix those issues, and they keep getting worse. If you don't believe me, let me show you a chart from the government. Throw the next slide up there. This picture right here takes you from 1900 to 2020, where our federal budget's projected. This tells you how much of our GDP, it's not the amount of money, it's the percentage of our national budget that we put towards dealing with these type of issues. And if you can see from 1900 to 2020, it's not how much money we spend, it's the percentage of our national budget we spend on these things. So you look at that and go, it's not because of inflation, it's not because numbers have changed, it's the amount of money we are spending is hand over fist more than we could ever imagine on these problems, but yet the problem persists and we continue to decline. So if it's not a lack of funding and money that is the problem here, what is the problem? I can tell you what the problem is. It's very basic, it's very simple. It's the disintegration of the American family. It's the breakdown of the family unit. It's the falling apart of having a biological mom and dad with their children and sticking together with their children throughout their raising and beyond that. It's the breakdown of the American family, and no amount of money is ever going to fix that problem. What are the factors then that have led to the breakdown of the American family? Let me tell you what they are, because it's pretty clear cut. What has led to the breakdown of the family? Adultery and the casual view of divorce. That is the two things that have broken down the family over the last 50 years, is the amount of adultery that happens now compared to what it used to, and the view that divorce is just an easy thing and it's an easy out now, and that's what we can do. We just got to go through the legal paperwork and we can be done with it. And there's no longer a thing of going, it's worth sticking it out. It's just better just to divorce and walk away. Here's what's interesting. The passage we're going to talk about today, Jesus deals with both of these issues. And here's what's also fascinating. When you read the Bible, I always hear a lot of times from people who don't know Jesus Christ and don't go to church, they go, it was written 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago with the Old Testament stuff. It has nothing to do with us today. And you're going, dude, it's the exact same problems we deal with today that he was dealing with back then. The only difference is technology has changed and our lifestyles have become more comfortable versus what it was back then. But people are people. Okay, sins are sin. The same temptations that were back 2,000 years ago are the same temptations that are still sitting before us today. People don't change. Maybe technologies do. And Jesus addresses the people issues. So if you have your Bibles with you, turn to Matthew chapter 5. As we move on to the next section here of the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to be starting in verse 27 of chapter 5. And Jesus is going to start addressing these issues. And here's what he says in verse 27. He says, you have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. So he says, you Jewish people and you people listening to me in my crowd, you've all heard the commandment from the 10 commandments that says, do not commit adultery. And he says, but I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus says, you've all heard, God just doesn't want you to commit adultery. And then Jesus comes in and says, you know what? No, don't commit adultery, but if you're even lusting over someone that's not your spouse, you've already committed adultery with them in your heart. Now you look at that and go, whoo. Okay? The people even back then had to be somewhat shocked and like, you're telling me lust is on the same scale as adultery in your eyes? And he's going, yeah, it's the same thing. So we have to define what is lust, because we could have all different descriptions in here. We're 150 people sitting here. What and how would you define lust? Here's how I define it. This is my own definition. You're not going to find it in a dictionary or anything, which means this is probably the correct one, just so you're aware. No, here's how I would define lust. And I specifically define it this way so it applies to both men and women. And you'll see here why in a second. I describe lust as this. It's desiring or cultivating or taking the steps to be around or to develop a relationship. So it's desiring or cultivating a sexual or an emotional relationship with another person, whether they are real or fake. All right, so let me read that again. Lust is desiring or cultivating a sexual or an emotional relationship with another person, whether they are real or fake. And you go, real or fake? Well, we live in a different society today with different technology. So let me explain that. Lust isn't just me looking at someone I know in my life and desiring to maybe have a relationship with them or think about them in a sexual way and they're not my spouse, or try to pursue that relationship. In our lives today with men, it plays out another way, which is the fake side, which is pornography, which is they are people you are never going to meet. They're not people you're ever going to have a relationship with. They are people on a computer. They are people on a book, whatever it is. They are fake people to you, but you are developing a sexual relationship with that thing or that fake view of sex or whatever else you want to say. For men, that's the fake side. For women, it happens through books and movies. It's not just physical men in your life that you know and you try to develop a relationship with. It can be what you would call the soft porn book industry for women, which is you read these books about these wonderful, sensitive men who are the greatest guys ever, and you start going, man, I wish my husband was that way, and my husband really stinks because the guy in the book's really good, and I wish my husband was like the guy in the book. And I would tell you this, that's not a whole lot different than your husband looking at pornography, because you're desiring your emotional or your sexual needs met by someone, and you're thinking of someone other than your spouse. It happens through movies for ladies as well. Men, we already know this happens. For women, I can bring up the current context, the book series of Shades of Grey, 50 Shades of Grey, and the movie. Okay? That's the same thing as male porn. It's just for women. Let's just be honest. And they're fake people. They're not real people we're ever going to meet. But you are taking your desires that are meant for your spouse, and you're putting them on someone else and looking for someone else to meet those needs in your life. That is lust. Okay, that's the best way I can describe it. What Jesus is saying is it does the same damage to your marriage as having an actual affair, because you are dividing your loyalties and you are putting your attention and your energies towards someone else that's other than your spouse. And that's the same thing adultery does. And he's going, they are one and the same in a lot of ways. Jesus is saying, don't fool yourself thinking just because you're not touching that you're not actually causing any harm, because you are. You are in the process of destroying your marriage when you are lusting over other people other than your spouse. Now, can you lust over your spouse? Absolutely. It's what God desired for you to do. You are to lust after your spouse. There is to be an emotional connection, a sexual desire. Those things are supposed to be there, and they're supposed to be met by your spouse. And you are to work on it as a couple to keep that desire within you as a husband and as a wife. That's where it's to stay. Jesus wants your romantic desires to be singularly focused on your spouse. Did you get that? God wants your romantic desires to be singularly focused on your spouse. I use the word romantic because it can cover the guys and the ladies. But he wants your singular romantic focus on your spouse that God has given you. Now, he goes on in verse 29 and 30, and he says this: so if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And then he says, and if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, a couple of things here. He brings out a couple of illustrations, and he says, your eye, even if it's your good eye. So back then, understand, everyone didn't have glasses. So it's very possible, and you can figure it out even if you don't wear glasses. You have one eye that usually compensates for the other one and works a little better than the other. He's going, even if it's your good eye that's leading you to lust, gouge it out, because it's better to gouge it out than to let lust destroy your entire life and sends you, ultimately, he says here, to hell. Then he brings up the hand, and you can make the connection however you want to make the connection, but it's a pretty obvious one. And he brings up the hand and says, even if it's your strong hand, which is if you're right-handed or left-handed, even if it's your strong one, it's better to cut it off and lose it if that's the instrument that's causing you to lust and to fall into sin than to keep it and be lost forever. And he's making that illustration to you. What he's telling them is this, to take seriously the sin in your life and the things that cause the sin in your life. He is not, I do not believe, saying actually gouge your eye off and chop your hand off. What he is saying is those are instruments that lead to lust. And if those are instruments and things in your life that are instruments that lead to sin, you need to take it seriously and figure out a way to get rid of them in your life. So let me give you some suggestions, some application of what you can do to resist the temptation of lust in your life. The first thing I'm going to tell you, I brought this up several weeks ago when we talked about marriage, but the first thing that you can do is this. Sometimes you have to give up things that you are entitled to, things that are perfectly okay, but you have to give them up to protect yourself and to protect your marriage. One of those things I would suggest is privacy. You are entitled to privacy. You are entitled to have your private stuff and whatever else. But when you are married, you are one with your spouse according to God. And your marriage should be one. And I brought this up several weeks ago, which is this. You should not have separate dealings with your money. You should not have separate social networks. You should not have separate emails and those types of things in your life unless your spouse, if you have a separate one, has all the passwords and can access them anytime they want. As a husband, men, you will hear this and go, forget that. I have my own private stuff. You know what? You want to take care of your marriage and you want to resist lust in your life that's not good and it's not towards your spouse and that will destroy your marriage, give her the passwords, open the books. All right? Get it. If you have issues there that you go, I can't do that because I would tell you this, get rid of all that then and turn over all the passwords and start new. But today, if you want to resist lust, make sure you guys are one and you have equal access to everything. Women, same thing. If you have separate accounts, separate emails, separate social media stuff, you need to have your husband have access to all of them, and you should be able to see everything front and center as a couple. It will do you well to do that. It will help you resist the temptation of lust. 33% of divorces that happen in America today list social media as one of the problems that led to divorce. Social media, 1 in 3 divorces, where Facebook is the one that's number one that's named. Facebook is the reason, or not the main reason, but one of the reasons that led to the divorce. Make sure you have equal access so you can check on each other and keep each other accountable as a husband and wife. Another thing I would suggest, you don't spend time with people of the opposite sex without your spouse present. You do not go to dinners. You don't go hang out. You don't go see movies. You don't go to a group thing here or there with people of the opposite sex unless your spouse is with you. Your spouse needs to be with you. I understand there might be certain circumstances with work-related things that you can't avoid that. Make them rare and far in between. And do everything you can that when I'm socializing or I'm doing with stuff with other people, if it's with anyone of the opposite sex, my spouse is there with me. Why? Does it mean you're always going to have a problem? No. Does it mean you're giving the devil a playground to play with you? Absolutely. You're putting yourself in a situation where you can be tempted and go, you need to avoid those situations the best you can. The last thing I would encourage you to do is this, and these are all things I can tell you we do in our relationship, me and my wife, is know each other's schedules and where you are at all times. All right? You need to know where your husband is, even when he's at work. And men, you need to know where your wife is, even when you're at work or she's at work. You need to know what the schedule is. That doesn't mean you need to be calling them all the time and going, are you where you're supposed to be? Okay? Schedules change or whatever. But I understand there can be over-controlling people that we'll just call the psychotic people who are overbearing. Okay? Come talk to me if you're in that situation. We'll figure out a happy medium. But what I encourage you to do, know each other's schedule. It creates a lot less opportunity to isolate yourself and get caught up in lust, because lust is always secretive and it's very seductive. It's always something that you do behind the scenes, and you never let the person you're married to know what's going on because it's secretive. So you need to eliminate all the opportunities to create that secretness, because it will limit your opportunities to lust over other things. And that's what Jesus is saying. If it's your good eye, gouge it off. If it's your good hand, cut it off. Why? Because it will save you from destroying your marriage and ultimately destroying your soul if you can't get a hold of things. All right? Next thing he moves on to is this. He then goes on and he says, in verse 31, he says, you have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. Now, back in that culture, what it was for the Jews is you could, if I wanted to get divorced, all you had to do is go get the right legal paperwork from the clergy, that would have been them, the priest. Get the right paperwork and you could hand it off to them and you could legally divorce them for whatever reason you wanted. Now, it does not mean divorce was rampant back then or anything, but you could come up with whatever reason you really wanted to go, you know what, I just don't love my spouse anymore. And specifically here, it was the men who were empowered back at this time. But basically, a man could go, you know what, my spouse, Ann, you're not really my spouse, just so you all know, but my spouse, Ann, she's been really mean to me the last 2 weeks, and I'm really annoyed with her, and I don't really love her anymore, and I'm sick and tired of her. And I've been looking at these ladies over here, and I really like them, and there's a possibility I'd rather have them as my wife than I'd like to have Ann as my wife. So you know what? I'm just going to go get a certificate of divorce, and I'm going to divorce Ann, and it's going to free me to go do whatever I want to do, and I'll go hook up with someone else, and I'll get myself a new wife who's better than Ann. Not that your husband could ever get a better spouse. Just using you as an example, Ann. All right? So he says, you guys have heard this, that you can divorce your wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. You got to understand what had happened here is divorce had become like an escape hatch for a person's dissatisfaction with their spouse. And back in that day, just like today, divorce was always a real and present option when things got tough in a marriage. And people viewed it as this was a way out, and they had convinced themselves that they could just walk away from their marriage without any real consequences to themselves or to God or anyone else involved in here. And they had just convinced themselves it was fine, it was dandy, and God, as long as I didn't commit adultery on them, you know what, that's fine. I can hand them a certificate of divorce and I can move on with my life and go be happy. And what happens is this: when divorce is an option in your marriage, you will not fight as hard for it as you should. Because there will become limits where you go, it's not worth fighting anymore, and I will just separate and I will go off my way. And what I would tell you as Christian believers, divorce shouldn't be an option in your marriage. The only thing that should be an option in your marriage is to fight for it. To fight for it to the very end. There are different circumstances that can change things. I understand there's abusive situations, stuff like that. That's separate. I'm talking in a relatively, whatever it means, normal marriage relationship. You fight for it. You don't look at divorce and go, when things get tough, I know I can throw a divorce card out there and move on. That does nobody any good, and Jesus is going to deal with that. Because he goes on and he says with this, he says in verse 32, "But I say that if a man divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery." Let me stop you and understand what he's saying. He's going, if you divorce your spouse for any other reason than they were unfaithful sexually to you with someone else, you are causing her to commit adultery. Now, let me explain why. Back in that day, if you were a young bride or a young wife and your husband divorced you, you pretty much were at a place where you had to go marry someone else. Okay, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You were really forced into having to go find another relationship and find another man who would take you so that you could be married again just for survival's sake. So what he's saying is if you divorce your wife for any reason other than sexual unfaithfulness, you're going to cause her to go have adultery because she's going to have to go be with some other guy and get married to someone else, and then there's going to be adultery because she's still technically, in my eyes, married to you. And you're going to cause her to go commit adultery. And he's letting them know, it's not there's no consequences if you just simply give your wife a divorce certificate. There's consequences. I will hold you accountable for forcing your wife to commit adultery because technically that's what you're doing. Then he goes on and he says, and anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. Now, there's always a lot of confusion on this because a lot of you come from divorces, all right? What he's talking about here is he's kind of flipping. He first talks about the man. Now he's kind of talking almost about a man and a woman in cahoots, which is very possible, which is this. Two people are lusting towards each other. They start making a relationship and a bond together, and they start to get in their minds, you know what, let's divorce our spouses, and then we can hook up and we can get married. Or someone on the outside who's not necessarily married yet, but looks at a married woman or a married man and goes, I'd really like to be them, and they start a relationship and go, okay, just divorce your spouse and we can run off together. And he's going, anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. So if you think that's a good plan and there's no consequences to that, you're committing adultery because you're breaking that sexual relationship between these two people. All right? Jesus is making it very clear that divorce was not intended to be an escape hatch for people that were going to start living their lives for him. What he meant divorce to be is it was almost a concession to people whose spouses had destroyed their relationship by being unfaithful. So almost Jesus throws out divorce as kind of going, I understand some relationships can be absolutely devastated because your spouse was unfaithful and it can't be put back together. And in that place, I will have a concession and you can actually divorce them and move on. He is not saying, if your spouse commits adultery, you are to go divorce them. That's not what he's saying. I know in God's eyes, because it's a concession, God would be perfectly happy with you trying to put it back together and fix it and still find something that honors God in it. God would be pleased by that. He does not say, if they have adultery, you go divorce them. He just says, if they have adultery, you could divorce them. You have a right in God's eyes to divorce them and be legitimate at that point. Here's the deal. Jesus wants his people, to direct their romantic desires towards only one person. And that one person in their life, if you are married, is to your spouse. That's who your romantic desires are to be aimed towards. If you want to improve your marriage, stop dividing your romantic desires and focus them on only one, your spouse. All right? If you want to give your kids the best chance to be successful in this life, stop dividing your romantic desires and focus them on only one, your spouse. If you want to know what you can do to address the overwhelming number of issues in our society today, stop dividing your romantic desires and focus them on only one, your spouse, and then encourage everybody else around you to do the same thing. We are the people of God. Jesus calls us to live a different lifestyle, to walk a different path than the rest of the world. And when the rest of the world sits here and mocks marriage and mocks people who have been married for years and says, you know what, people can't actually stay faithful their whole lives because we're just people, we're all going to fail. I can watch stuff and it actually gets mocked as if that's a joke. Like that's horrible to actually live that lifestyle. Jesus is going, that's what I expect. And I expect you to live that lifestyle. Not only live it, I expect you to tell others to do the same thing. Because if you want to fix the world's problems, you want to fix your problems, you want to fix your marriage problems, the way you do it is singularly focus on your spouse. And you will see a dramatic change in the rest of your life. If you follow Jesus' path here, what you will find is this. You will find the significance you're looking for. You will find the satisfaction you're looking for in your spouse rather than all these other people in your life. Would you pray with me?